Well, John, I just wanted to start by congratulating you on this fantastic show at Metivier. I spent a very lovely hour or so at the gallery a few days ago and had a chance to sort of bask in these wonderful paintings, and had a chance to see some of the images beforehand in our conversations that we're having around your show that you did with us at McMichael. But to see the whole thing completed was really quite something. And I'm wondering...
Well, it was a revelation to me too. I only see them one at a time in my studio.
And exactly. And what surprised you about it when you saw the show hung?
Well, what surprised me, because they were done over a period of 2 years, and I was really kind of inventing a new way for me to paint in some ways, or at least doing something different. I thought there'd be more a sense of development. Mm-hmm. And what I was surprised by was how consistent they all were with each other. I felt when I began doing these that I was really, I had to struggle a bit to figure out how to put all these animals and birds into a landscape painting. And I thought that would be more obvious than it was, but it wasn't. So that was good.
Although it has some stylistic similarities to, of course, to the work that you've done before.
Oh, yes. Yes, of course.
Yeah. So tell me, how did this series begin? Because it began, my understanding is it began pre-COVID, but then became sort of amplified and deepened as a project by COVID. Can you explain the trajectory of that?
Yes. Well, as you know, I was in the winter of 2019, I was very busy completing a series of portraits for an exhibition at the McMichael.
Yes.
And I had been so focused on that project for 4 years that I really didn't have anything planned beyond it. And as the spring of 2019 came along, I was up the shore at the island I go to in the summertime, and
where is that?
That's on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, south of Britt, north of Point of Barrel. And my son David and his partner Ashley came back from a canoe trip and said, "Wow, we've been back in Prisk Bay and it's full of birds and animals," and they were sort of bubbling with excitement. And this was a bay that I'd explored a lot by canoe 25 years ago, when the water was at a high point then as well. Mm-hmm. And so the water cycle on Georgian Bay goes up and down sort of 5.5 feet. And so as recently as 2013, that bay was probably dry with no water in it. And so there would be a very different group of animals and birds and frogs and things, and probably far less of them. So I just thought, I'll get in a canoe and go down there. Sort of their excitement was contagious. And I paddled around and it was enchanting. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what the paintings might look like, but I knew there would be paintings if I just kept following this sense of excitement I had. Mm. So I just photographed and sketched everything I saw, anything that caught my eye. Without a concept that how it would fit into a painting, I just sort of documented it. And then it began to sort of evolve into a series of paintings, all of which have this theme of high water.
Mm-hmm. And it must have been a lovely sort of respite after the schedule of making the portrait paintings that we were lucky enough to show, which involved a lot of travel and human contact and, socializing and scheduling and planning. This was the opposite of that.
It was the exact opposite. And so it was kind of, it meant that that everything could be serendipitous, that I could simply go out without any object in mind and just walk around and paddle around, and that something would come of it. And that was very different to what I've been engaged in for the last 4 years, which, as you describe it, involved a lot of planning and logistics.
Mm-hmm. And is this a landscape that has been known to you your whole life? I mean, how long have you had a relationship with this landscape?
Well, yes, my whole life. I mean, the specific area in Britt since 1985. Mm-hmm. But when I was born in April, and my parents ran a summer camp for girls on the southern end of Georgian Bay. Mm-hmm. And so I guess when I was 3 months old, I was in June, I was taken up and stuck in a wash tub with a blanket in it and lay there listening to the wind whistling through the trees. So the overall landscape has been part of my whole life.
Pretty deep in you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what were some of the, so then COVID came along, and everyone's sense of what they were doing and the kind of their sense of time and so on shifted. And there were a lot of the busy things that we normally do that you suddenly couldn't do anymore. How did that quarantine situation sort of deepen or change this project? And what were some of the experiences you had that you'll never forget from that? Because I'm sure there were many.
Well, the show was actually scheduled for last April at Metivier, and we had to cancel it. And so then there was a period of time of, oh my God, what's going to happen? The world might come to an end. That was sort of April. But it gave me studio time. But then by May, we were officially allowed to get in a boat and go out to the island, which I did. And then what happened was, it was, in the art world anyway, everything got pushed forward.
Yeah.
So it was like a window opened up where I had free time, a previously unscheduled time. Yes. So I had all of May, June, July, August, September to make more work for this exhibition and to spend more time out doing things and to become a halfway proficient photographer, which I wasn't before, so that I could get photographs of the birds and animals. Because what happens is you're paddling along in a canoe and something jumps up and it like there's a moment of shock. And by the time you picked your camera up off the bottom of the canoe, it's gone. So you have to learn how to then find those species on their own somewhere where they're feeding or nesting and get some photographs of them. And then those can be plunked into the painting in the situation where the experience occurred.
Yes. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
you have to kind of learn to anticipate where you're going to maybe be able to get that shot.
Yes. And so I did learn, I relearned things that I had learned when I first left art school. When I first left art school, I lived with a Métis family on the outer islands of Georgian Bay. And I had a lot of time because I didn't have a career at that point. I wanted to have a career, but I just left art school. So I spent a lot of time just watching birds and animals and what they did when they were migrating, what they did when they were nesting. And so in a sense, I was going back, rediscovering all of that, most of which I'd forgotten. But it's the same skills that a hunter has. You have to sort of know where the ducks are going to land in the evening and be there and catch them coming in. And so I sort of gradually over the summer relearned those things with the help of my children, who would say, if you go to the mouth of the big river in the evening, the wood ducks will come in and land. And then they'll swim into these little tufts of grass and find a little spot surrounded by water that's dry and sleep there for the night. So then I could go there and get a photograph of them and then use that in a painting.
Yeah, and wait for that moment.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that because I think my understanding is that you had a lot of time by yourself in the canoe, watching and letting things happen kind of organically. What were some of the things that you sort of bore witness to that you might not have experienced had you been on a more brisk schedule?
Well, one of the strangest things was I came around a corner in a bay called Prisk Bay, and I was expecting to see ducks or geese feeding in the weeds. And I saw what I thought were like two ducks' heads sticking up. And so I stopped the canoe and I kind of drifted around, and then it moved a bit and it moved a bit. And I thought, those aren't ducks or geese. And then all of a sudden, the head lifted up out of the water and it was a moose. I'd been looking at the two ears.
Wonderful.
So then it was up right up to its neck in water, and then it would put its head down and eat some roots and come back up. So then it finally realized I was there, and it sort of turned and looked at me, and it fed for a little while longer. And then it went, okay, he's not leaving. I have to leave.
It's like having a noisy couple at the next table, right?
Yeah. And then it turned and sort of slowly walked out of the water. And as it walked out of the water, it got into shallower and shallower water. So I saw more and more of it. And then it went up a slope, and then it turned around and gave me this withering look like, okay, if you're really not going to leave, I'm going to walk into the bush. And then it just, away it went. But that was quite lovely because it was an extended period of time, and I had a little bit of time at the beginning to watch what it was doing before it realized I was there. Mm-hmm. And that's happened with a couple of times with herons, great blue herons. I've come across them when they're feeding, and they're because they're intent on feeding, they haven't spotted me. And then I got to watch them stand for quite a long time, and then they spear a fish with their beak. They stand in like a foot of water, and some foolish fish swims by them, and they spear it with their beak, and then they keep releasing it and spearing it again until the fish is really quite incapacitated. And then sometimes they lift it up and the fish is like stuck on the beak. They throw it back in the water, and then finally they take it and flip it up in the air, and it comes down head first, and they just are there underneath it with their mouths open, and it just goes straight down into their stomach. It's quite
I've
something.
Never seen that. That is amazing.
So I saw it twice this summer.
Like it's sort of like the secret life of animals. Like who knew that they had such elaborate skills, right? In
yes.
Doing what they do.
Yeah, like I don't know how.
I'm
sure that they must have to learn how to flip the fish. I mean, I'm sure there must have been a few misses when they were young.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there's a kind of humility that comes with observing this stuff. I mean, I think you mentioned to me once before, and when we were talking earlier about coming to understand the kind of elaborate, complex ecology of a beaver dam, and how that, I can't quite remember what you told me, but it was about how it creates its own very distinct type of ecosystem for feeding for all animals. It doesn't just have to do with the beavers. It's how they then create opportunities for all their fellow creatures. Yes,
they do. And it's the water moving over the dam creates a little, first of all, they've created a pond in behind where there was just a stream. Mm-hmm. So that's all flooded and becomes one kind of ecosystem. But where it drops down into Georgian Bay, there's always running water, and the running water and the amount of organic matter in that water sort of creates another little system for other kinds of frogs and fish. And so there's sort of one set of species up top, another one down below, but the dam itself is often a crossing point for land-based mammals. So if they want to it's complicated to cross the beaver pond. And on the other side is Georgian Bay and water. So if you want to get from A to B, you come to the beaver dam and cross it. So if you're sitting there like I would be in the morning, there'd be like a family of raccoons, and they'd come along and they'd sort of walk across the dam. And then there was a red squirrel on one side and a red squirrel on the other, and they wanted to get together, but I was in the way. So they were like doing the red squirrel chatter, basically yelling at me to clear out so they could get together. So if you had to pick a spot to sit for a while, it would be at a beaver dam.
Apparently beavers themselves are not always the silent type.
Well, no, they're, they make a lot of noise when they dive because they do the big splash with their tail. They talk to each other, which I heard one day in a lodge canoeing by it in the morning. I guess they didn't know I was coming, and you could hear them kind of chat, like talking to each other inside, which I'd never heard before.
What does it sound like?
Well, I can't. I don't think I could reproduce it, but it's kind of a I don't know. It's like nothing else, but it's not weird like a sandhill crane, which sounds very prehistoric. It's got a squawk that sounds like a dinosaur.
Right.
This is just what you'd think a beaver was like, sort of mumbly and guttural.
It's guttural. It's not chirpy. It's not.
Oh, no.
Not like a squirrel or.
No.
Gruffly.
Yeah.
Well, I think everyone's going to have to go on Google to hear beaver.
Well, yes.
Now.
Yes.
But this is something about our national icon that we did not know. Grumbly.
Yeah. And they are everywhere. Once you get onto the Shield territory, north of Port Severn and in and around Parry Sound, the whole landscape has been created by beaver. Like all these ponds, all these little catch basin pond opportunities in the Shield, where there's water moving down off the rocks and it moves through a little stream. All they have to do is find the narrowing point, put a dam, and it creates a pond where there had been just a stream. And literally, like everywhere you go in the north, there are beaver ponds everywhere and a lot of active beavers.
So, I mean, one of the things I found myself thinking about looking at your show and also at Ed's show of the photographs of his part of the Ontario landscape that he's attached to is this kind of deep looking at the natural world. And it's made me think about the Group of Seven, because we've been working at McMichael on a book about the Group of Seven, A Light Vision, that just came out. And one of the things that became really clear as we kind of dug into the period when the group was formed is that there's been much writing about those paintings that return to nature being a response to the war in Europe and nation building and a new sense of pride in Canadian national identity and so on. But what I have not seen talked about that much is the retreat to nature in response to the Spanish flu epidemic, which killed so many hundreds of thousands of people and was in many ways as traumatic as the war was, and came right home to people in Canada, to their own loved ones and their own families in the aftermath of what had already been a horrific experience, the First World War. And so I'm kind of interested in seeing, both of you really returning to a deep look at the natural world in a moment when we're all forced to kind of step away from the rhythms and textures of urban life, as indeed would have been the case then 100 years ago.
Yes, well, with the combination of the First War and the pandemic, I think it shattered people's faith. It shattered their religious faith, but I think it shattered their faith in civilization, or in Western civilization too, to a certain degree. I know from reading the letters of W.J. Wood, who was an associate of the Group of Seven and an invitee to their first exhibition, he completely lost his faith in the First World War, and he wasn't even in the trenches. He was with the Simcoe foresters cutting wood that they could use to reinforce the trenches. But just the whole ridiculous effort of sending troops over the top and having them sent to their own slaughter, I think had a huge effect on everybody. So I can see that, and the pandemic was, I mean, in our town of Midland, my grandfather Hartman's first wife died. She was a nurse, and they didn't have enough hospital beds, so they seconded one of the elementary schools, made it a hospital. She was a nurse in the hospital. She died from the flu. So it was, if anything, had a more profound effect than COVID has had. But I had, to tell you the truth, I'd never thought of it in relationship to the Group of Seven. I had thought of the war, but I think you're right. I think that the flu would have had an equal effect.
Well, the idea of going into the landscape that is, a lot of the language around the Group of Seven is around a pristine, the cleansing qualities of the natural world and the pristineness of it. And I think that kind of language may well have something to do with the threat of contagion, and that was part of urban experience at that precise moment.
Yes, you're right. I mean, I'm sure it did, and they did see the. They had a habit of ignoring the human-made elements in a landscape they might be looking at.
Yes.
Not in all their paintings, but in the stuff that's really become well known. If they were on Georgian Bay, they tended to not put McCallum's cottage in the painting, even though it was sitting there in the view, or
exactly, or indeed the indigenous people, evidence of indigenous people that have been on those lands for.
Yeah, and there was lots of activities in the teens and 20s in those spots they were going to. There was lots of human activity, but they did tend to ignore that and look for a wilderness that was supposedly uninterrupted by human activity.
Yeah,
and of course we all know that was it was a creation that started in their minds and ended up on the canvases.
So your paintings have a lot of stories hinted at in them. In contrast to Group of Seven, you have little narrative moments happening in the pictures that might not immediately be decipherable to viewers. Can you give us an example of one from the show that just to decode it for us?
Well, there's there's a number of paintings that have canoes in them.
Yes.
There's actually one big painting of high water from I think it's called From Head Island to Prisk Bay. It's a squarish painting, and there are lots of birds flying in the space between the viewer, and the landscape below, which is an aerial viewpoint. But there is also a person sitting in a little pram, like a small sailing boat, like an optimist. Who's my friend Doug Moore, who was paraplegic, who came up every summer to the inlet, lived on a pontoon boat that he built a cabin on, and went out in this little boat with 1.5 horsepower on it and painted. So that's an image of him. He died tragically in a ski accident at Whistler a number of years ago. So it was a kind of memory of him. So what I find is I'm in the landscape, I'm painting it, or I'm back in my studio making a painting about an experience in there. But when I'm in that landscape, I'm remembering people like Doug, and I'm remembering other stories. There's a little watercolor that's in the show of Prisk Bay. It's a vertical study, and it's got a figure standing in the water up to his chest in the lower part of it.
Yes.
And that's me. I actually
high water at Prisk Bay. Yeah.
Yeah. In the last high water cycle in the 90s, I was down there one April and I was canoeing, and I'm a good, I know what I'm doing in canoe, but I just took a stroke that was too hard and the canoe went over. And, the next thing I knew, I was standing up to my neck in water and the canoe was upside down and it was really cold. So I thought, well, I'll just, making the painting brought back that memory. And then I said, okay, I'll stick myself standing there in the water. The scale's wrong.
Yeah.
I'm way too big for the landscape, but to make the scale right, I would have had to make myself this teeny, tiny little wee thing that you couldn't.
Well, I mean, I think that's, scale is one of the really interesting things about this whole series. And, it's actually been a feature in your painting, of course, for years, has been the kind of almost dreamscape illusions of scale where things can be, out of conventional scale in relationship to each other. And I think this is one of the key distinctions of, John Hartman as a landscape painter or John Hartman as a wildlife art painter. We were joking the other day together about, I didn't know I was going to turn into a wildlife artist, but of course you have and you haven't. But one of the things that, at least in this show, but one of the things that's really interesting is that sometimes the space is quite conventional. There's one painting in the show where the prow of your canoe is going into the landscape and the cranes are taking off, and it's fairly, looks like it would be based on a photograph in which everything is integrated into the same kind of perspectival field. But then there's other works where everything is all, a frog might be the same size as a fox. And I found myself looking at the show and thinking about, as one of Manet's paintings that has always been one of my favorite, which is his painting of a woman, a Mademoiselle V, dressed up as a bullfighter. Mm-hmm. And she's in a bullfighting ring, very large and prominent in the foreground. And in the background, there's a bull and a matador. Mm-hmm. And the spatial context that they're in, like she's way too big, or the matador and the bull are way too small. Mm-hmm. What you actually see is that the figure of Victorine is actually floating. She doesn't really appear to sit on the ground. So
yeah, the only way
I was thinking about that painting when I was looking at this show.
The only way that painting makes sense is if she is floating in the air closer to you than it's depicted, or that matador and horse and bull are at the wrong scale. Something's at the wrong scale.
Yeah, and the same thing, the same thing with like Déjeuner sur l'herbe, is that the crouching woman in the background is way too big perspectively. Yes. But clearly Manet was not an artist who was incapable of rendering things in scale. So what do you make of, when you look at that, what do you think Manet is doing there? Because I think it has some relationship to what you're doing.
I think if a painting is, well, I think for starters that the single point in time and single point in space way of constructing space, which was invented in the Renaissance, that's the aberration. The more normal way is what came before and what sort of came in the 20th century when artists started to disrupt this unity of time and space. Because experience is, you're always moving. So everything you see, you're seeing it, you're never seeing it from one point in space. And you're also never seeing it, therefore, from one point in time, because, the minute you move your head just a little bit, everything shifts and changes. So I think that art that's driven by experience more than by theory will often disregard rules of perspective and unity of time and space and these kind of things. And that's what all art before the Renaissance did. It was a painting of Christ and there was a story. There'd be three events. There'd be the three key elements of the story all happening in one painting. And the part of the story that was more important, everything would be bigger. And the part of the story that was less important, things would be smaller. And it would relate to their importance to the story, not to the rules of perspective. And I've just never felt that following perspective makes any sense. But I also know that inserting things into the sky and kind of disrupting the landscape view that I've also carefully tried to paint is bothersome to some people. It just doesn't work for some people.
Yeah,
but for other people,
it seems to be that the heart, though, of what you're trying to do, which is to kind of compress into the pictorial image a range of experiences and memories that are all somehow simultaneous in the work of art.
Yes, and that's the only way I sort of can figure out how to do it.
As Neil Young would say, that's my sound.
Yes.
Well, I think it works really beautifully. I think that the feeling you have in the exhibition is really, I think partly it's because of this persistent use of the aerial perspective, but there is this feeling of floating and remembering and being in a kind of, the show really does have a kind of euphoric feeling about it. And I do think aerial perspective is part of that too, which is a really distinctive part of your work now for many years.
Yes, it has been. And it all goes back to dreams I had as a young teenager of flying basically over the landscape of the summer camp that my parents ran. And so my intimate knowledge of the place meant that whatever part of my brain was creating the dreams could recall all that imagery and turn it into essentially what an aerial drone video shot would look like now, looking down obliquely at the landscape as you move across it.
Yeah.
And so I've always tried to, for a very long time, right from the beginning of my painting, I've tried to figure out how to recreate that feeling by introducing aerial views into my paintings. And you know, when I went to Europe after art school and I looked at all the art I'd studied in art school, the one painting that really caught me by surprise that I'd never seen in reproduction and which just absolutely glued me to the floor for an hour looking at it was Albrecht Altdorfer's painting of the Battle of Issus. So you're, you know, 2,500 feet in the air, supposedly over the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius of Persia, and the battle's taking place, and there are all these little minute soldiers, and then you look out over a bay, and there's ships in the bay, and then there's mountains behind that, and then there's a big banner in the sky that explains it all. And I thought, perfect. I like, you know, for me, that was like the perfect painting.
Yeah, because it gives you, it allows you to experience the whole thing at once.
Well, it just set up so many possibilities. I didn't, for a long time, I just didn't, it took me a very long time to develop a working method that even came close to that in terms of presenting possibilities. But in the very, very beginning, I was painting, in the early 80s, I was painting the history of the peninsula I live on, which was in the 17th century, the Jesuit mission to the Wendat. And, but I was trying to put the priests in the Wendat all at scale. So they were like tiny little
mosquito scratches.
Yeah, so that worked, but it works better, I think, to suspend these things in the space between the viewer and the landscape.
Well, I think it works absolutely beautifully. It's a wonderful, wonderful show, John. Congratulations again. It's always such a pleasure to see what you do.
Thank you, my dear.